The deafening roar of 90,000 screaming fans vibrating through the stadium concrete should have been the only thing dominating the VIP box. But the most ruthless syndicate boss in the Eastern Hemisphere had completely stopped breathing. A man whose pulse had never spiked during million-dollar extortions or violent betrayals found himself utterly paralyzed. His dark, calculating eyes locked entirely on the stadium below, shattered not by a sniper's scope, but by the unrestrained, radiant smile of a woman he had never met. Welcome back to another immersive journey. In today's story, you will discover what happens when a man who has lived his entire life in the freezing shadows is suddenly blinded by the purest light, fundamentally altering the course of his dangerous empire. If you want more addictive, heart-melting romance stories brought to you every single week, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Baek Do-jin did not exist in the same reality as the rest of the world. For the 32 years he had drawn breath, he had occupied a reality constructed entirely of ice, leverage, and absolute, unforgiving control. To the global financial sector, Do-jin was the phantom CEO of a monolithic shipping and logistics conglomerate, a titan of industry whose business acumen was as flawless as his bespoke, razor-sharp suits. But beneath the polished marble floors of his corporate empire beat the dark, violent heart of the country's most feared criminal syndicate. Do-jin was not simply a businessman. He was an apex predator holding the leashes of politicians, judges, and rival factions. He operated out of a high-security penthouse suspended in the clouds above the city, a space that perfectly mirrored the man who lived in it. It was stark, monochromatic, and completely devoid of warmth. There were no photographs, no sentimental artifacts, no evidence that a human soul resided within its bulletproof glass walls. Do-jin did not permit warmth, because warmth bred sentiment, and sentiment was a vulnerability that got men killed. On a suffocatingly humid Tuesday in July, Do-jin sat at the head of a sprawling obsidian boardroom table. The air conditioning was intentionally cranked down to a frigid temperature, a psychological tactic that kept the men sitting opposite him physically uncomfortable and acutely aware of their disadvantage. At the far end of the table sat a shipping magnate who had foolishly attempted to siphon $3 million from one of Do-jin's offshore accounts. The man was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he stammered through a labyrinth of pathetic excuses. Do-jin did not interrupt him. He merely sat back in his leather chair, his massive, heavily muscled frame entirely still. He possessed a terrifying physical presence, broad shoulders, sharp, aristocratic features carved from granite, and eyes so dark and void of emotion they looked like obsidian stones. He did not blink. He simply watched the man unravel, observing him with the clinical, detached curiosity of a scientist watching an insect drown. "I can replace it," the magnate gasped, pulling at the collar of his soaked shirt. "Mr. Baek, I swear on my family's life, the funds will be wired back by tomorrow morning." It was an oversight, a clerical error in the manifest. Do-jin slowly leaned forward. The subtle movement was enough to make the three armed lieutenants standing in the shadows of the room instantly shift their weight. "A clerical error," Do-jin repeated. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that barely rose above a whisper, yet it commanded the acoustics of the entire room. He didn't sound angry. Anger was an emotion, and Do-jin did not indulge in emotions. He sounded entirely, terrifyingly hollow. "You swear on your family's life to cover a clerical error?" "Yes," the man choked out, nodding frantically. Do-jin slowly picked up a silver pen from the table, turning it effortlessly between his long, heavily scarred fingers. "Men who steal from me are dealt with," he stated smoothly. "But men who lie to me insult my intelligence, and I find that far more difficult to forgive. The money is no longer the issue. The issue is that you believed you were smart enough to survive the theft." Do-jin didn't raise his voice or issue a direct threat. He simply locked eyes with his lieutenant standing by the door and gave a fraction of a nod. The meeting was over. The man's fate was sealed in a terrifying, suffocating silence as he was dragged from the room, his pleas bouncing uselessly off the soundproof walls, Do-jin stood up, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous precision. He felt absolutely nothing. No adrenaline, no satisfaction, no guilt. His internal world was a barren, frozen wasteland. He viewed human beings as equations, liabilities, assets, variables to be calculated and controlled. "Sir," his chief of security murmured, stepping forward with a leather tablet. "The private jet is fueled and prepped for departure. The route to the World Cup final has been cleared by international airspace authorities." Do-jin let out a slow, silent exhale. The closest thing he ever showed to annoyance. He absolutely despised the World Cup. He despised sports, he despised crowds, and he despised the unpredictable, chaotic nature of human emotion that accompanied massive global events. To Do-jin, a stadium filled with 90,000 screaming people was a logistical nightmare of security risks. However, the VIP suites at the final match were essentially a neutral ground for the world's most powerful and corrupt figures. A Colombian cartel head, a Russian arms dealer, and 2 European senators he needed in his pocket were all attending. It was an obligatory theater of power, a place to shake hands and quietly secure shipping routes while the masses distracted themselves with a ball on a pitch. "Ensure the security detail is doubled," Do-jin commanded, his tone completely flat as he walked toward his private elevator. "I want 0 interactions with the public." We arrive at the VIP box exactly 5 minutes before the match begins, and we leave the second the final whistle blows. I will not tolerate being trapped in a sea of screaming bodies. "Understood, sir," the lieutenant bowed sharply. As the private jet breached the clouds hours later, Do-jin stared out the window into the endless expanse of black night. He sipped a glass of neat whiskey, the burn of the alcohol the only sensation he allowed himself to feel. He was a man entirely fortified against the world, existing in an impenetrable fortress of his own making. He was certain that nothing in the chaotic, loud, colorful world of the stadium could possibly breach his walls. He was completely, profoundly wrong. The atmosphere inside the colossal stadium was a living, breathing entity, vibrating with the collective adrenaline of nearly 100,000 people. The night sky above was illuminated by blinding floodlights, and the deafening roar of chants, drums, and synchronized stomping physically shook the concrete pillars. It was a cathedral of human passion, loud and entirely uncontained. But inside the fortified walls of Suite 404, that world did not exist. Baek Do-jin stood near the back of the sprawling VIP box, completely detached from the chaos unfolding beyond the reinforced, soundproof glass. The suite was an oasis of sterile luxury, smelling of aged scotch, expensive leather, and calculated ambition. Behind him, a Russian arms dealer named Volkov was leaning over a mahogany table, tracing a proposed maritime shipping route across a digital map. "The port authority in Marseille is secured," Volkov stated, his thick accent cutting through the quiet hum of the suite's climate control. "If your vessels arrive at midnight, the inspection manifests will be blank. But I need assurance. Baek, if the French maritime police decide to run a random sweep, I need to know your men will not fold." Do-jin held a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his left hand, the ice clinking softly against the glass. He was dressed flawlessly in a midnight blue suit that clung to the terrifying breadth of his shoulders, his posture carrying the relaxed, lethal stillness of a coiled snake. He did not look at Volkov. His dark, impenetrable eyes were fixed blankly on the pitch far below, watching the tiny, brightly colored figures of the players dart across the green grass, without registering a single movement. "My men do not fold, Volkov," Do-jin replied, his gravelly baritone devoid of any inflection. "If a sweep occurs, the cargo is burned, the vessel is scuttled, and the crew goes down with it. There are no loose ends in my supply chain. You are paying for ghosts, and I provide them." Volkov let out a low whistle, clearly unsettled by the chilling absolute zero of Do-jin's pragmatism. "You are a machine, Do-jin. A very expensive, very terrifying machine." Do-jin did not bother to respond. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze idly drifting from the pitch to the cascading tiers of the stadium seating below their luxury box. It was a sea of painted faces, waving flags, and manic, untethered emotion. He felt a mild, clinical disgust looking at it. To allow oneself to be so deeply affected by a game, to scream, to weep, to embrace strangers over the trajectory of a leather ball, was a glaring display of psychological weakness. He was about to turn away, to finalize the logistics of the arms deal and call for the jet to be prepped for departure, when a sudden shift in the crowd's movement caught the periphery of his vision. It was not a threat. His security detail, flanking the doors, remained perfectly still. It was just a burst of movement in the section directly below the VIP glass. Do-jin's dark eyes flicked downward, fully intending to dismiss whatever it was. Instead, the temporal rhythm of his reality abruptly fractured. She was standing 3 rows beneath the glass partition, oblivious to the fact that she was currently occupying the dead center of the most dangerous predator's crosshairs. Her name was Zuri. She wore a vibrant, emerald green national team jersey that contrasted flawlessly with her warm, deeply melanated skin. Her dark hair was a gorgeous, voluminous halo of curls that danced wildly in the stadium breeze. But it wasn't her beauty that paralyzed the king of the underworld. Do-jin was surrounded by beautiful women daily calculated, manufactured, and hollow. It was her light. Down on the pitch, a player intercepted the ball and made a sudden, breakaway sprint toward the goal. The entire stadium inhaled sharply, holding its collective breath. Zuri practically vibrated with anticipation. She gripped the shoulders of the friend standing next to her, leaning forward over the metal railing, her eyes wide and shining with an intoxicating, unrestrained hope. The player took the shot. The ball sailed past the goalkeeper's outstretched hands and hit the back of the net. The stadium erupted. Zuri threw her hands into the air, and a laugh ripped from her throat that Do-jin could not hear through the soundproof glass. But he felt it. He felt the sheer, percussive impact of her joy hit the center of his chest like a physical blow. She threw her head back, her face breaking into a smile so blinding, so violently radiant and unguarded, that it seemed to pull all the ambient light in the stadium directly toward her. She turned and pulled her friend into a jumping, ecstatic embrace, her entire body vibrating with the pure, unadulterated thrill of the moment. Up in the sterile, freezing suite, Baek Do-jin stopped breathing. His hand, gripping the crystal tumbler, went completely rigid. The ice shifted in his glass, the sound deafening in his ears. Every single calculation, every logistical route, every threat he had spent the last decade mastering, instantly evaporated from his mind. He had never seen a human being look like that. In his world, smiles were currency. They were weapons used to manipulate, to placate, or to mask a knife being slipped between the ribs. No one in his ecosystem was ever truly happy. They were merely surviving. But this woman, she was vividly, fiercely alive. She was entirely unburdened by shadows. The sheer velocity of her happiness defied everything Do-jin understood about human nature. Back? Volkov's voice filtered through the room, sounding as though it were coming from underwater. Did you hear the proposal regarding the customs officials? Do-jin did not blink. He did not turn around. He took a slow, heavy step forward, his expensive leather shoes silent on the carpet, moving closer to the reinforced glass. Tae-jin, his lethal second in command, instantly noticed the shift. The lieutenant's hand dropped subtly to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, his eyes sweeping the crowd below. Boss? Tae-jin murmured, stepping closer. Do we have a situation? A target? No, Do-jin rasped. His throat felt incredibly dry. The gravel in his voice was thicker, carrying a faint, undeniable tremor that Tae-jin had never heard in the 10 years he had served the syndicate. Do-jin pressed the fingertips of his free hand against the cold, bulletproof glass. The surface was freezing, separating his world of death from her world of vibrant, undeniable life. He watched as Zuri playfully shoved her friend, wiping a tear of sheer joy from her eye, still beaming at the pitch. He was not feeling lust. Lust was a biological equation, easily solved and dismissed. What Do-jin was experiencing was a profound, existential gravity. He was a man who had spent his entire life in the freezing dark, suddenly staring directly into the sun. He couldn't look away, and for the first time in his meticulously controlled existence, he didn't want to. He wanted to know what that kind of light felt like. "Leave the customs proposal on the table," Dojin ordered quietly, his obsidian eyes never leaving the woman in the emerald jersey. "The meeting is over. Volkov, get out." "Excuse me?" The Russian oligarch sputtered, deeply offended. "We are talking about a billion-dollar corridor bike. You do not just walk away from Taejin," Dojin interrupted, his voice dropping to a demonic, immovable register that instantly silenced the room. "Remove him. If he speaks again, remove his tongue first." The suite emptied in a matter of seconds. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, leaving Dojin entirely alone in the silence. Below him, the match raged on. The crowd roared and shifted like a turbulent sea. But the King of the Shadows remained anchored to the glass, his massive tattooed hand resting flat against the barrier, completely consumed by the sudden, terrifying realization that the ice in his veins had just begun to crack. In the brutal, hyper-calculated architecture of the underworld, information was harvested exclusively to be weaponized. When Baek Dojin ordered a dossier on a target, it was to uncover their vices, their debts, and the fragile pressure points he could exploit to dismantle them. 72 hours after the World Cup final, Taejin stepped into the frigid, monochromatic silence of Dojin's penthouse, holding a sleek black folder. The lieutenant's face was an unreadable mask of professional detachment, but beneath it lay a profound, deeply unsettled confusion. He placed the folder onto the obsidian desk. Dojin did not immediately reach for it. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out at the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city he silently ruled. He wore a crisp white shirt, the cuffs rolled up to expose the dark, winding ink of his tattoos, a glass of amber scotch resting loosely in his grip. The city below was his chessboard. Yet for the past 3 days, he had been entirely unable to focus on the game. His mind was relentlessly, frustratingly consumed by the phantom echo of a radiant, uninhibited laugh. "Her name is Zuri," Taejin reported, keeping his voice carefully neutral. 27 years old. She runs an independent art studio in the historic district, teaching ceramics and painting to children. Her financial records are entirely unremarkable. No criminal affiliations, no significant debts, no ties to any rival factions. "Boss, she is a complete civilian. There's zero strategic value here." "Leave it," Dojin murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that betrayed absolutely nothing of the seismic shift occurring in his chest. Taejin bowed sharply and retreated, the heavy oak doors sealing shut behind him. Dojin slowly turned, his dark eyes locking onto the folder. He approached the desk and opened it. Inside were a handful of surveillance photographs, captured from a discreet distance. Zuri carrying a massive, oversized canvas down a sunlit street. Zuri laughing with a barista outside a corner cafe, a smudge of dried clay on her cheek. Zuri kneeling on a sidewalk to pet a golden retriever, her dark, voluminous curls falling over her shoulders. There was no darkness in her, no hidden angles. To a man who had survived his entire life by anticipating betrayal, her absolute transparency was the most terrifying, captivating anomaly he had ever encountered. The obsession began not as a desire to conquer, but as an overwhelming, gravitational necessity to understand. Dojin did not want to control her reality, he simply wanted to witness it. The rhythm of the syndicate boss's life fundamentally altered. Board meetings regarding illegal weapons shipments and offshore laundering were abruptly rescheduled. The fleet of heavily armored black SUVs that usually patrolled the city's industrial shipping yards found themselves parked discreetly on the tree-lined avenues of the historic arts district. Dojin became a silent, towering phantom haunting the periphery of her world. He never approached. He never interfered. He sat in the cavernous, climate-controlled silence of his armored Maybach, obscured by deeply tinted glass, and simply watched her exist. It was a bizarre, profoundly solitary ritual. He was a king studying a flower, terrified that if he reached out to touch it, his cold hands would instantly cause it to wither. On a damp, overcast Tuesday afternoon, Dojin's vehicle was parked across from a small, bustling bakery she frequented. The sky broke open, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. People on the street immediately scrambled for cover, cursing the weather, pulling newspapers over their heads, their faces twisted in mundane misery. Then, Zuri walked out of the bakery. She had no umbrella. She was holding a brown paper bag protecting a pastry, her worn denim jacket entirely insufficient for the plunging temperature. Do-jin's hand instinctively drifted toward the door handle of his car, a sudden, entirely foreign protective instinct flaring in his chest. He was a man who ordered executions without a spike in his heart rate, yet the thought of her being cold caused a sharp, physical ache in his ribs. Before he could push the door open, she stopped at the edge of the curb. Instead of rushing or looking annoyed, Zuri simply tilted her head back, closed her eyes, and let the heavy summer rain wash over her face. A slow, incredibly peaceful smile spread across her lips. She laughed a soft melodic sound that Do-jin could almost hear through the thick, bulletproof glass of his sanctuary. She stepped directly into a puddle, unbothered by her soaked canvas sneakers, and began to walk down the street with a leisurely, dancing grace, completely at peace with the storm. Do-jin slowly pulled his hand away from the door handle. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, leaning back against the expensive leather seat. He was paralyzed by the sheer, devastating beauty of her resilience. In his world, a storm was something you fought. You built walls, you armed your men, you braced for impact. But Zuri did not fight the world. She simply allowed it to happen, finding light in the exact places where Do-jin only saw gray. "Boss," his driver murmured softly from the front seat, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. "Do you want me to send someone out with an umbrella?" "No," Do-jin replied, his voice thick with a raw, unfamiliar reverence. His obsidian eyes tracked her vibrant, retreating figure until she disappeared around the corner. "Do not disrupt her. No one approaches her. No one so much as breathes in her direction. Am I understood?" "Yes, sir." For 3 weeks, Do-jin lived in this agonizing, beautiful purgatory. He memorized the cadence of her daily life. He learned that she bought her coffee black, but always asked for an extra sugar packet to give to the homeless man on the corner. He learned that she painted with her windows open, regardless of the noise of the city, singing off-key to old soul records. He watched her mend broken things, comfort crying children, and navigate her small, colorful world with an effortless, staggering kindness. He was absorbing her light from a distance, a starving man pressing his face against the window of a feast. But the distance was beginning to fracture his legendary control. The passive observation was no longer enough. The freezing, suffocating reality of his own life was becoming unbearable now that he knew exactly what warmth looked like. Late one evening, sitting in the total darkness of his penthouse, Do-jin stared at the single photograph of her he had kept, the one where she was smiling at the rain. He traced the edge of the glossy paper with his heavily scarred thumb. The beast that ruled the eastern seaboard realized, with terrifying clarity, that he was done watching the sun from behind bulletproof glass. He needed to step into the light, even if it blinded him entirely. For a man who orchestrated hostile corporate takeovers and dismantled rival syndicates with absolute, clinical precision, crossing a quiet city street shouldn't have felt like stepping off a cliff. Yet, as Baek Do-jin stood on the damp pavement outside Zuri's art studio, the undisputed king of the underworld realized his heart was executing a heavy, arrhythmic thud against his ribs. He had dismissed his security detail 3 blocks away. Tae-jin had looked at him as if he had lost his mind, the boss of the most powerful criminal empire in the country, walking completely unprotected into a civilian neighborhood at dusk. But Do-jin knew that if he brought his shadows into her light, he would suffocate it. He had to enter her world exactly as she existed in it, unguarded. Do-jin pushed open the heavy glass door of the Sun and Earth studio. The small bell above the frame chimed a bright, cheerful note that felt violently out of place to a man accustomed to the heavy silence of boardrooms and bunkers. Instantly, the atmospheric pressure shifted. Do-jin stepped out of the cold, smog-choked evening and into a sensory sanctuary. The air inside smelled of damp earth, kiln fire, and sweet jasmine tea. The space was a chaotic, beautiful mess of half-finished ceramic bowls, vibrant canvases stacked against exposed brick walls, and hanging plants that caught the warm amber glow of the string lights draped across the ceiling. Do-jin stood frozen just inside the doorway, an absolute monolith in a custom charcoal gray wool suit. He was an apex predator who had accidentally wandered into a greenhouse. He felt massive, dangerous, and acutely aware of his own sharp edges. "I'll be right with you. Just let me center this clay before it collapses." Her voice floated from the back of the studio, carrying that same melodic, unburdened warmth he had memorized from a distance. Do-jin slowly walked further inside, his heavy leather shoes silent against the scuffed hardwood floor. He rounded a tall display shelf and finally saw her. Zuri was sitting at a potter's wheel, wearing a faded, oversized denim apron completely splattered with gray slip. Her wild, dark curls were tied up in a messy knot with a colorful silk scarf, and there was a streak of wet clay swiped directly across her cheekbone. Her hands were firmly planted on the spinning wheel, guiding the earth with a gentle, hypnotic pressure. She did not look up immediately. In Do-jin's world, when he entered a room, men stood at attention, dropped their eyes, and stopped breathing until he gave them permission. Here, he was simply a man who had to wait his turn. The sheer normalcy of it was incredibly disorienting, yet strangely intoxicating. With a final, smooth motion, Zuri slowed the wheel to a halt and sat back, wiping her hands on a heavily stained towel. She let out a satisfied sigh, completely oblivious to the lethal titan standing 10 feet away. Then, she turned around. Do-jin braced himself. He knew what his face looked like. He knew the aura he projected. He fully expected her eyes to widen, for the primal instinct of fear to wash over her features as she registered the overwhelming, dangerous presence he carried into the room. Instead, Zuri's dark eyes met his, and a bright, effortless smile broke across her face. It was the same smile from the stadium, the one that had shattered his reality. But this time, it was directed entirely at him. The sheer, percussive impact of it hit Do-jin square in the chest, effectively knocking the air from his lungs. "Welcome," Zuri said brightly, stepping away from the wheel and untying her apron. "Sorry about the wait. The clay has a mind of its own today. Are you looking for something specific, or just browsing?" She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back from his size or the sharp, aristocratic coldness of his features. She walked straight up to him, entirely fearless, treating the city's most terrifying syndicate boss like a perfectly ordinary human being. "I am," Do-jin started, his deep, gravelly baritone sounding unusually rough. He cleared his throat, desperately trying to anchor himself. "I am just looking." Zuri tilted her head, her warm eyes briefly scanning his immaculate, incredibly expensive suit. A small, amused glint sparked in her gaze. "Well, you are definitely the best-dressed person to ever walk into this dust trap. Be careful brushing against the tables, or that beautiful wool is going to look like a chalkboard." Do-jin stared at her. No one spoke to him like that. No one teased him. The absolute lack of sycophancy, the absence of terror, it was a revelation. "I will be careful," he murmured, his hands resting stiffly at his sides. Zuri smiled again, moving toward a small counter to pour hot water from a kettle. "It's freezing out there tonight. Would you like some jasmine tea? I just brewed a fresh pot. I do not want to impose." "It's just tea," she laughed, pouring a steaming cup and walking back to him. She held it out. Do-jin slowly reached forward. As he took the small ceramic cup, the tips of his long, calloused fingers brushed against the warm, soft skin of her hand. A literal jolt of electricity sparked up his arm. He gripped the cup tighter than necessary to stop his hand from trembling. "Thank you," he said quietly, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers. "You're welcome," Zuri replied, holding his intense gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly polite, a subtle curiosity blooming in her expression. "I'm Zuri, by the way, Do-jin." He gave her his real name. It was a massive security risk, a vulnerability he never afforded strangers. But he realized, with terrifying clarity, that he physically could not lie to her. "It's nice to meet you, Do-jin," she said, testing the syllables of his name on her tongue. It sounded entirely different when she said it, not like a command or a threat, but like a melody. "So, what do you do when you aren't risking your tailored suits in pottery studios?" "Logistics," he answered smoothly, the practiced corporate lie rolling off his tongue. "Shipping and acquisitions." Zuri wrinkled her nose playfully. "That sounds incredibly stressful. And very rigid. You look like a man who carries a lot of rigid schedules on his shoulders." Do-jin went entirely still. Her perception was staggering. Beneath the casual banter, she was looking directly past the armor, seeing the heavy, suffocating weight he carried every single day. "It can be demanding," he admitted, his voice dropping into a quieter, more intimate register. He looked down at a small bowl resting on the display table between them. It was a dark, charcoal ceramic, but a deep crack running through it had been filled with shimmering, molten gold. Zuri noticed where his eyes had settled. "Kintsugi," she explained softly, her tone shifting from playful to reverent. "It's a Japanese method of repairing broken pottery with gold. The philosophy is that the breakage and repair are part of the object's history, rather than something to disguise. It makes the piece more beautiful for having been broken." Do-jin stared at the bowl, the philosophy resonating violently within the barren, frozen wasteland of his own chest. He was a man composed entirely of fractures, held together by violence and control. He had spent his life hiding the breaks, terrifying the world so no one would dare look close enough to see the cracks. Slowly, Do-jin lifted his dark, intense gaze from the repaired bowl back to Zuri's face. She was looking up at him, the ambient amber light catching the gold flecks in her dark eyes. There was no judgment, no fear, only a gentle, open curiosity. "I will take it," Do-jin rasped, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "The bowl?" Zuri smiled, clearly pleased. "Are you sure?" "I have perfect ones over on the no." Do-jin interrupted softly, his massive presence leaning just an inch closer to her warmth. "I want the broken one." As Zuri moved to carefully wrap the bowl in brown paper, Do-jin stood in the quiet studio, holding the warm cup of tea she had given him. He realized that the impenetrable, frozen fortress he had spent 32 years building had not just cracked tonight. It had completely shattered, and he had absolutely no desire to rebuild it. Over the next 2 months, the rhythm of Do-jin's existence fractured into two violently opposed realities. In the towering, glass-walled citadel of his corporate headquarters, he remained the undisputed king of the eastern seaboard, a ruthless, calculating phantom who dismantled empires and commanded a shadow syndicate with absolute, unforgiving authority. But at 5 o'clock on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the apex predator ceased to exist. The transition was a quiet, profound surrender. Do-jin would dismiss his armored motorcade, strip off his silk tie, and walk the remaining 3 blocks to the Sun and Earth studio. He did not arrive with grand, sweeping gestures or displays of intimidating wealth. He knew instinctively that trying to buy Zuri's world would only suffocate the very light he was so desperate to stand in. Instead, the man who moved millions of dollars in illegal cargo began to orchestrate invisible, microscopic miracles just to see her smile. It started with the studio's temperamental boiler. On a Tuesday, Zuri had offhandedly mentioned the biting cold creeping through the floorboards. Do-jin had simply nodded, his dark eyes cataloging the slight shiver in her shoulders. By Thursday morning, a crew of the city's most expensive, discreet contractors had completely replaced the building's heating system, leaving behind a forged invoice citing a landlord's routine upgrade. Then came the supplies. A rare, heavily back-ordered cobalt blue glaze that Zuri had lamented being unable to source for her advanced students mysteriously arrived in a pristine crate, shipped via a phantom logistics subsidiary. But the deepest cracks in Do-jin's armor were revealed in the small, agonizingly tender routines he built directly with her. He became an immovable fixture in the corner of her studio. He would arrive carrying 2 paper cups, 1 black coffee with exactly 1 packet of sugar for her, and a dark roast for himself, along with a specific almond pastry from the bakery 3 streets over. He never asked what she liked. He simply knew, having memorized the cadence of her life long before she ever knew his name. Zuri was fiercely observant. She was not naive enough to believe Dojin was merely a mid-level logistics manager. She saw the heavy, bespoke cut of his suits, the intricate, winding tattoos that mapped their way across his corded forearms, and the deep, faded scars across his knuckles. She felt the heavy, atmospheric shift of danger that trailed him like a shadow. Yet, she never pressed him for the brutal truths of his world. Instead, she looked at the most terrifying man in the city and chose to see the exhaustion behind his obsidian eyes. She offered him the one thing his money and power could never secure: a safe harbor. The definitive, undeniable crack in Do-hyun's emotional foundation occurred on a quiet, snow-dusted Friday evening. The studio was empty of students. The air thick with the smell of wet earth and the comforting low hum of the newly installed radiators. Zuri was sitting at the front desk, massaging her wrists with a quiet wince. She had spent the last 4 hours wedging heavy blocks of clay to prepare for a massive children's workshop the following morning, and the physical toll was evident in the heavy slump of her shoulders. Do-jin, who had been sitting quietly in the corner reading a ledger on his tablet, paused. He watched her rub her aching joints, a sharp, involuntary flare of protectiveness igniting in his chest. He set the tablet down, completely abandoning a high-stakes negotiation regarding a European shipping corridor. He stood up, shrugging off his $1,000 suit jacket and draping it carefully over the back of his chair. He unfastened his platinum cufflinks, rolling the crisp white sleeves of his shirt up past his elbows, fully exposing the dark, lethal ink of the syndicate branded into his skin. He walked silently to the back of the studio, stopping at the heavy wooden worktable loaded with 50-pound bags of raw clay. "Do-jin?" Zuri called out softly, stepping around the counter. "What are you doing?" "Preparing the clay," he answered smoothly, his deep, gravelly voice filling the quiet room. He reached into the bag, pulling out a massive block of the dense, gray earth with zero effort. "You don't have to do that," Zuri protested, her eyes widening as she rushed over. "You're wearing an incredibly expensive shirt, and wedging clay is exhausting manual labor. I can finish it tomorrow." "Your wrists are hurting," Do-jin stated. It wasn't a question, it was an absolute immutable fact that he refused to ignore. He pressed the heavy block of clay onto the canvas-covered table, his massive, heavily muscled shoulders shifting as he drove his weight forward, effortlessly kneading the dense material. "Sit down, Zuri, drink your tea." Zuri stopped at the edge of the table, entirely captivated by the staggering contrast of the scene. The man before her looked capable of snapping a steel beam in half, a titan draped in dark secrets and lethal grace, yet he was using his immense strength to perform a mundane, messy task solely to spare her an ounce of physical pain. She didn't sit down. Instead, she stepped closer, leaning her hip against the edge of the worktable, watching the rhythmic, powerful movement of his scarred hands. The silence between them was thick, warm, and deeply intimate. After 20 minutes, Do-jin finished the last block. He stepped back, his breathing perfectly even, though a light sheen of sweat dusted his collarbone. His hands and forearms were completely coated in wet, gray slip. Zuri picked up a warm, damp towel from the sink and walked over to him. "You are a terrible liar, Bak Do-jin," she murmured softly, a fond, knowing smile playing on her lips. Do-jin froze, his heart executing a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. "What do you mean? Logistics managers do not know how to systematically throw their weight into 50 pounds of clay without breaking a sweat," she teased gently. She didn't hand him the towel. Instead, Zuri reached out, her warm, soft hands wrapping around his massive, clay-covered wrists. Do-jin's breath completely vanished from his lungs. He stood entirely paralyzed as Zuri carefully began to wipe the damp earth from his skin. Her touch was incredibly gentle, tracing the heavy lines of his veins, her thumbs ghosting over the faded, violent scars on his knuckles. In the past, anyone who noticed his scars was met with a terrifying, icy glare that promised death. But as Zuri's delicate fingers mapped the history of his violence, Do-jin did not flinch. He did not pull away. For the first time in his life, he leaned directly into the touch, his heavy eyelids fluttering shut as a ragged, shuddering sigh escaped his chest. "Why do you do this?" Zuri whispered, her voice dropping into a register so tender it made his ribs ache. She looked up from his hands, her dark, radiant eyes locking onto his. Why does a man who carries the weight of the world come here just to sweep my floors and knead my clay? Jin opened his eyes, looking down at the woman who had effortlessly, entirely dismantled him. The cold, impenetrable fortress he had spent a lifetime building was completely gone, leaving only a man standing utterly bare in the light. Because my world is deafening, Zuri, Jin rasped, his voice trembling with a raw, terrifying honesty he had never spoken aloud. He slowly turned his hands over, gently threading his clean fingers through hers. It is cold, and it is violent, and it is entirely devoid of light. But when I am here, when I am with you, it is the only time I have ever known what it means to breathe. Zuri's breath hitched, a soft, answering warmth flooding her eyes. She didn't pull back from the darkness he confessed to. She simply stepped closer, anchoring him exactly where he belonged. And in that quiet, earth-scented room, the king of the underworld finally surrendered to the undeniable truth. He was never going back to the shadows. The transition from a creature of the abyss to a man capable of standing in the sun was not a peaceful one. For Baek Do-jin, dismantling a criminal empire was infinitely more complex than building one. 6 months after he first walked into the Sun and Earth studio, the absolute zero of Do-jin's existence had completely thawed, and the resulting floodwaters were washing away the foundations of his syndicate. The transformation was not a sudden, dramatic epiphany. It was a quiet, relentless metamorphosis driven entirely by the memory of a woman's warm, damp towel gently wiping the clay from his scarred hands. He had realized, with bone-deep certainty, that a man could not hold a gun and a woman's heart with the same hands. It was a freezing Friday at midnight when the final tether to his old life was severed. Do-jin stood at the head of the obsidian table in his penthouse boardroom. The room was deathly quiet. Kneeling on the imported carpet was the head of a rival faction who had attempted a violent coup on Do-jin's southern shipping ports. In the past, this was the exact scenario where the king of the underworld would exact brutal, theatrical vengeance. Tae-jin stood nearby, his hand hovering over his holster, waiting for the inevitable command to execute the traitor. But Do-jin did not give the order. He stood completely still, his dark, impenetrable eyes looking down at the trembling man. A year ago, Do-jin would have felt the cold, familiar grip of absolute control. Now, all he felt was an overwhelming, suffocating exhaustion. The metallic scent of fear and adrenaline in the room physically repulsed him. It smelled nothing like damp earth, kiln fire, or sweet jasmine tea. Do-jin slowly looked down at his own hands. The heavy, faded scars across his knuckles were still there, but they no longer felt like badges of honor. They felt like chains. "Boss," Tae-jin murmured, breaking the heavy silence. "Give the word." Do-jin closed his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. When he opened them, the icy, bottomless void that had terrified the eastern seaboard for a decade was gone. In its place was the immovable resolve of a man who had finally found a reason to live, rather than simply survive. "Take his territories," Do-jin commanded softly, his deep, gravelly voice devoid of any malice. "Absorb his fleet into our legitimate logistics subsidiaries. Then put him on a plane and ensure he never returns to this hemisphere. Let him live." Tae-jin's head snapped up, utter shock breaking through his professional mask. The kneeling man collapsed forward, sobbing in pure, disbelieving relief. As the guards dragged the rival boss from the room, Do-jin turned to his second-in-command. Tae-jin stared at him, trying to comprehend the mercy he had just witnessed. "The shadow operations are officially dissolved," Tae-jin, Do-jin stated, his voice carrying the finality of a closing tomb. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, shedding it as if taking off a suit of armor he never intended to wear again. The weapons, the extortion, the underground corridors shut them down. "We are transitioning entirely to the light. The Baek conglomerate will operate cleanly, or it will not operate at all." "Sir," Tae-jin breathed, struggling to process the magnitude of the directive. "You are giving up the empire. You are giving up absolute power." No, Dojin replied, a faint, devastatingly peaceful smile touching the corner of his mouth. I am finally laying down a burden. The dark is deafening, Taejin. I am done listening to it. An hour later, the heavy glass door of the Sun and Earth studio chimed. The studio was dim, illuminated only by the amber glow of the string lights and the soft, orange embers of the cooling kiln. Zuri was sitting cross-legged on the floor, organizing a stack of freshly fired ceramic bowls. She wore a soft, oversized cream sweater, her dark curls tumbling loosely over her shoulders. She looked up as Dojin entered, and her entire face instantly illuminated with that bright, unburdened smile that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his universe. But as he stepped further into the light, her smile softened into an expression of profound, gentle understanding. Dojin looked entirely different. He was not wearing his pristine suit jacket. His tie was gone, and the collar of his crisp white shirt was undone. The terrifying, atmospheric tension that usually trailed him like a phantom was completely absent. For the first time in his life, Baek Dojin did not look like a syndicate boss. He just looked like a man coming home. He crossed the room, his heavy footsteps silent on the floorboards, and sank slowly to his knees on the hardwood floor directly in front of her. Zuri immediately abandoned the ceramics. She reached out, her warm, soft hands framing his sharp jawline. Dojin, she whispered, her thumbs brushing his cheekbones. What happened? You look lighter. Dojin leaned heavily into her touch, turning his head to press a long, desperate kiss against her palm. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of her skin, anchoring himself to her reality. I was a man made entirely of ice, Dojin began, his voice a thick, trembling gravel that vibrated through the quiet room. He opened his dark eyes, pouring his entire soul into her gaze. For 32 years, I lived in a freezing, violent darkness. I did not know I was suffocating because I had never tasted air. And then, I saw you at the stadium. Zuri's breath hitched, her eyes widening slightly as he confessed the origin of their collision. I saw you smile at the world, and my reality completely fractured, Dojin continued, his large, calloused hands coming up to gently grip her wrists. I was so cold, Zuri, but when I saw your light, I became curious. I just wanted to stand near the warmth. I thought I could watch you from the shadows, but your fire burned down my entire fortress. A hot tear slipped down Zuri's cheek, catching the amber light of the studio. She didn't pull away, she leaned closer, entirely captivated by his absolute, terrifying vulnerability. I ended it tonight, Dojin whispered fiercely, the absolute truth ringing in the air between them. The violence, the shadows, the empire. I stripped the darkness from my life because I refused to let it touch yours. You changed me, Zuri, fundamentally, irrevocably, and I do not want to go back. I never want to be cold again. Zuri let out a soft, broken sob of pure joy. She didn't ask for the brutal details of his past, and she didn't demand an explanation of his sins. She simply saw the broken man before her, filled entirely with the golden light of his own redemption. You don't have to go back, Zuri murmured, her voice fierce and unwavering. She slid her hands to the back of his neck, tangling her fingers in his dark hair. You are exactly where you belong. Dojin let out a ragged, shuddering breath and pulled her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his massive arms wrapping around her with a desperate, permanent devotion. The kiss she pressed against his temple was a seal, an unbreakable promise that the shadows had officially been banished. The king of the underworld had surrendered his crown, not in defeat, but in ultimate victory. Baek Dojin had stepped out of the freezing dark, led entirely by the radiant smile of a woman who proved that love, ultimately, was the greatest, most unstoppable force of gravity in the world. Thank you for listening. If Baek Dojin and Zuri's breathtaking journey from the freezing shadows into the golden light captured your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Let me know down in the comments which moment of Dojin's beautiful transformation was your absolute favorite. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss another immersive, heart-melting romance story brought to you every single week. Remember, in Annie's empire of love, Love is the only law worth breaking.